This is abridged from Molly Ivins in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, May 2nd, 1993. We had some big excitement in my neighborhood on Thursday. For reasons too complicated to explain, there was a camera crew from New York in my house filming old boots. I was sitting in the study reading about the Civil War between the fundamentalists and the professional educators in Hawkins County, Tennessee, when the sound person rushed in and said, "There's a big pig in the street." Well, you never know what a person from New York will consider a big pig, but I wandered out to take a look-see, and sure as by God, there was a boar hog standing in the middle of Alta Vista Avenue in South Austin, Texas. Despite what you may have heard about South Austin, hogs are not common in the streets here. The neighbors were all piling out to inspect the beast with wonder. He was a particularly hairy specimen. Since we were Texans all, save the New Yorkers, naturally someone yelled, "Get a rope!" I fetched a rope from the pickup, and the guy driving the camera crew volunteered to lasso the beast, having, he said, some rodeo experience. The hog objected to this program and headed up into the Hopkinson's yard. Mr. Hopkins, who is 80-some and spends a fair amount of time napping on his front porch, came to and started waving his arms and hollering, "Shoo pig, shoo pig!" The hog headed for the Hopkins's hydrangeas with the full posse in pursuit, all giving directions to one another about the best way to lasso a hog. For some reason, Mr. Hopkins got to laughing. I go back to the house to phone the city's animal control folks and wind up talking to a lady who sounds like Lily Tomlin doing Ernestine. "And whose pet pig is it?" she inquired. "Lady, this is not anybody's pot-bellied pig. We're looking at 150, maybe 200 pounds of boar hog out here." "We had several cases of those pot-bellied pigs getting out," she replied. "Are you sure one of the neighbors isn't keeping a little pig in the house?" Meanwhile, the hog and posse come loping back down the block. I'm still arguing with Ernestine, who now wants to know my home phone number, blood type, and mother's maiden name because she has a form to fill out. Outside, the whole gang reappears in my front window, going the other direction like a scene in a Max Sennett comedy. Ernestine says, "And your social security number?" I go out to rejoin the posse, and we all pursue the hog, yipping and hollering after this miscreant swine. We chase it up one hill, down another, back up and into the brush behind the apartments where we lost him. The kids continued to search the woods looking for the spoor of the beast for another half hour, while the grown-ups stood around discussing the strategy of the hunt. It was generally agreed none of us had had so much fun in ages. By sundown, the hog hunt had already achieved the status of block mythology. The hog got bigger with every retelling, and those neighbors coming home from work mourned missing all the fun. I went back to reading about the terrible situation in Tennessee, where some folks became convinced their neighbors were Satanists and Lord knows what all, on account of the fundamentalists didn't like a story about Martians in the school book. Such a knot of religious intolerance, conspiracy theories, and lawsuits you never heard tell of. It just split that whole community to bits. I got to thinking about the variety of humanity that had just engaged in the great Alta Vista hog hunt. The guy from New York with his earring, the rodeo rye-whooper, Mr. Hopkins. Maybe we should let more hogs loose in this country. Isn't that how mankind learned to cooperate in the first place, by joining in the hunt? We could just focus more on cooperation instead of concentrating on our differences. Chasing hogs is more fun, though.
Jeff LaLande has lived in the River Valley since 1969. That is the same year that he graduated from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He went on to earn a Ph.D. in history from the University of Oregon. Jeff had over a 30-year career as an archaeologist and historian with the U.S. Forest Service and retired in 2008. He has published 2 books and a number of scholarly articles on the Pacific Northwest history. Jeff will be presenting to us today on the state of Jefferson. Welcome, Jeff. Bye-bye.
Okay, so first off, I need to tell you I'm going to be reading from my notes, so I'm going to be glancing away from the camera. In fact, people keep telling me I should look right into that little spotlight there. So I'll try to do as much of that as I can. But if I don't read, I will not get through in time this presentation. So greetings from the state of Jefferson. I've been a Jeffersonian since 1969, living most of those years in Ashland, but the last few years in Talent. And fortunately, our house survived the Alameda fire, but some friends of ours were not so fortunate with their homes that just burned to nothing. So with that, I should start. I'm going to be speaking on the state of Jefferson, the evolution of an idea. And I'm going to be talking about the three phases of the state of Jefferson movement over the past 160 years, 160-year-long search for identity of this area, meaning southwestern Oregon and northernmost California. So without further ado, I think I better hit share screen and bring up my PowerPoint. So to begin with, I think probably a number of you are already familiar, at least basically, with the concept behind the phrase state of Jefferson. And perhaps not only the historical events that culminated in late 1941, the so-called secession, but the broader reasons that southwestern Oregon and northernmost California had, and definitely still feel they have, far more in common with each other than they do with other parts of the respective states, and that neither of them have ever felt they got into fair shape from their distant state capitals, ever dominated by the interests of far more heavily populated parts. Looking at you, Portland. So, and thus, there was the birth of an idea down here on both sides of the state boundary. Let's overcome the political and physical barriers that separate us. This is Pilot Rock, which is visible in some places along I-5, both in Oregon, in Jackson County, and in over the border in California. Let's overcome the physical and political barriers that separate us. Let's throw in our lot together and decide our own destiny as a single new state. It's an idea that spanned over a considerable period of time, and from a historian's perspective, I'm going to ask, what is the meaning of this 160-year plus year-long search for regional identity? Here in a nutshell is what I've come up with by way of an answer. This state of Jefferson movement of ours down here, this history of well over a century and a half of intermittent proposals for separation and secession, reflects three very distinctive periods, each of them with very differing reasons for pursuing the seemingly quixotic dream. The first phase was that of the search for political identity. It is the briefest of the three, beginning in 1852 with the very first proposal for a new state and ending with the Civil War. This first proposed political entity definitely would have included northernmost California and very likely some of adjacent Oregon as well. Why? After all, California had entered the Union as a state only 2 years before, and Oregon still remained a federal territory that also included the rest of the Pacific Northwest. By 1850, 1851, following close upon the initial gold rush to the canyons of the Central Sierras, rich new diggings were discovered ever further to the north and northwest, as far away from the original mother lode country as the remote canyons of the lower Klamath River, about where the word Wairika is. And in 1851-52, prospectors found gold even further north, across that east-west line above Wairika, in Oregon Territory's Rogue River country. The resulting overnight influx of miners, merchants, farmers into this area down here formed what some new residents believed had reached a critical mass of potential power in northernmost California. That is, voters had now become sufficient in numbers, most of the miners still at this time, to justify creation of a new state. And they felt they were sufficiently removed from Sacramento that they deserved to have their own state. Thus it was in 1852 that some local politicians floated just such a proposal in the Sacramento legislature. It would have created a new state of Shasta, encompassing the uppermost Sacramento Valley and the rest of California to the north. Now this attempt failed, but only to be succeeded by another in 1853-54 for a state of Klamath, one that definitely would have extended north to include an adjacent piece of the Oregon Territory. An actual convention drawing delegates from the upper Sacramento, Trinity, Klamath, Rogue, and Umpqua River drainages to discuss the proposed new state of Klamath was held here in Jacksonville, in Jackson County, in 1854. As we know, this effort too came to naught. Legislators from elsewhere saw to it that northernmost California would remain an economic hinterland of the Golden State, and that the southwestern chunk of Oregon Territory stayed part of Oregon. Now, as southwestern Oregon steadily filled with settlers during the mid-1850s, politically ambitious men, lawyers for the most part, flocked like hungry ravens to Jacksonville. Among them was William Green Tavolt, a Tennessean who'd arrived in the Rogue River Valley during the gold rush and stayed, hanging out a shingle as an attorney. Tavolt also began Southern Oregon's first newspaper, using it to promote his extreme pro-Southern states' rights views, as well as to launch his political career. Now remember 1850s, sectionalism, question of slavery, splitting the country apart. You all know that. In 1857, Tavolt and like-minded pro-slavery politicos living south of the Willamette Valley proposed creation of a new federal territory out of the southern half of Oregon, one to be named the Territory of Jackson, and unlike Oregon Territory, would be open to slavery. Now this idea was met with scorn and disapproval elsewhere in Oregon, and it's probable that very few of Tavolt's local supporters down here actually wanted to live in the slave society that he envisioned. Nevertheless, the forceful Tavolt was elected to the territorial legislature in 1858 and soon became Speaker of the House. I'm uncertain if his scheme was originally intended to incorporate northernmost California into the so-called Jackson Territory's borders. But if the idea had been able to gain political traction, I think it very well could have. In fact, during the American Civil War, this guy you see before you, the irrepressible Tavolt, was one of those who encouraged secession of the entire West Coast to form a slave-holding Pacific Republic, was the term they gave it. Following the end of the Civil War, however, very few murmurs were heard about forming a new state out of the region encompassing Northern California and southwestern Oregon. With the arrival of the telegraph in the 1860s and of the railroad in the 1870s and 1880s, those two areas of the two states became ever more firmly, politically and economically, embedded within their respective states. So, what of this first phase? Because of the very real remoteness from the distant state capitals and territorial capitals, this period produced quite sincere proposals for a new state. And I think this first period can be seen as a time of lost opportunity, if you will. If there ever really was to be a separate state, a state of Shasta, Klamath, Jackson, Siskiyou, or Jefferson, it was during this first phase when such a proposal most likely could have succeeded. Politically, prior to the Civil War, the entire far West was a place where boundaries, whether physical boundaries on the ground or mental boundaries within people's ways of thinking, remained fluid, that is, still in flux, as yet undetermined. Now, the second phase. This, the period of search for political attention, began shortly after the turn of the last century. During our region down here, our region's second major economic boom time, the 1850s gold rush being the first. And with a minor exception in the mid-1950s, it basically ended with the nation's entry into World War II. By the first decade of the 20th century, the railroad had brought thousands of new arrivals into this region down here. Many of them lured here by slick promotional brochures touting its tremendous agricultural and commercial possibilities. This was a time of big new gold and copper mining ventures, of large-scale irrigation developments, of the Rogue Valley's fruit orchard boom, and of steadily increasing prices for real estate. During the early 20th century, however, the more populated and distant parts of the two neighboring states still wielded by far most of the political power in Salem and Sacramento. My own region's resentments grew, especially the often less than accurate perception of people down here that those far off places hogged far more than their fair share of tax expenditures. Again, thinking of Portland here. In 1910, rather than float a potentially viable and realistic idea of secession, which there really was not a realistic idea, as had occurred in the 1850s, local boosters, often, the kind of people that by nature were prone to exaggeration, proposed forming a state of Siskiyou. It would be comprised of several contiguous Northern California and Southwestern Oregon counties. Here again was a would-be political unit that schemed to incorporate adjacent parts of California and Oregon. However, this state of Siskiyou was not a serious secession proposal. It was a bid for attention. Accompanied by prominent coverage in Western newspapers, the idea was launched simply as a way to bring even more publicity to our then booming region. The state of Siskiyou was promoted as a place of tremendous natural resource wealth. In addition, the Siskiyou idea was used to amplify complaints about the two states' allegedly inadequate expenditure on local road construction. This remained a theme into future years. Especially, they wanted down here a paved Pacific Highway connecting the isolated region to Portland and the Bay Area, as well as new gravel surface roads to tourist attractions such as Crater Lake National Park. This is a jalopy making its way up to Crater Lake, as well as down the Klamath River Canyon and lots of other places that were without drivable roads. Interestingly to me, one Jackson County man who fully supported the secession campaign, his name was C.H. Klum, urged that the new states, this state of Siskiyou, the new state's name be changed from Siskiyou to Jefferson, thinking that the hallowed founding father's name could garner even wider national publicity than would the name Siskiyou. And I think he might also have suggested it because it would be far more pronounceable to outsiders than the sometimes puzzling pronunciation of Siskiyou or Siskiyou or various versions of that. However, Siskiyou's Jackson County proponents retained the original name, perhaps in part, I think, to cement their cross-border secession allegiance with residents of the huge Siskiyou County, California, right over the state border from us here in the Rogue Valley. By 1920, the North-South Pacific Highway, what is now called Old Highway 99 down here, had essentially, oops, I got out of sequence there, had essentially been completed through this region. By far, the most expensive per mile stretch of that lengthy road to be built. The tongue-in-cheek Siskiyou secession idea faded from popular memory. Our region's transportation infrastructure grew during the relatively prosperous times of the 1920s, and it grew even more during the Great Depression, due to generous amounts of the New Deal's federal dollars. The 1910 Siskiyou proposal had been nothing more than a publicity gimmick, one specifically geared towards bringing public attention to the region's bounty and governmental attention to the need, by and large, for better roads. The state of Siskiyou concept, not unsurprisingly, formed the template for the second phase's far more successful secession attempt, that is, successful in terms of gaining attention, the one of 1941. Now, the background of the 1941 episode, many of you probably know the basics, and I won't go into much detail. World War II was raging elsewhere in the world, and America's national defense spending was climbing through the roof. We were not yet in the war. But northernmost California and southwestern Oregon were again feeling ignored and left out, in large part because of lack of access to things such as mines, strategic metals, and timber. So, feeling ignored and left out, it was time for another attention-getting tantrum, if you will, another gimmick. The State of Jefferson episode came about in large part due to the actions of Gilbert Gable, mayor of tiny Port Orford, Oregon, down in Curry County on the coast, who was also a nationally known railroad investor and promoter and a nationally known railroad personality. And also, the second of the three people most connected with the 1941 event was Randolph Collier, who you see there on the far right, then a young, ambitious state representative from Siskiyou County, California, who later in life went on to become the longest serving California legislator and was known as the father of California's freeway system. Third is Stanton Delaplane, reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, whose editor evidently knew a good story when he smelled one. And Delaplane similarly played a very key role, and possibly the crucial one. He is, other than this story, he is best known for introducing Irish coffee to the United States. But in his recollections later, Delaplane recalled how it was him who suggested and guided the local 1941 secessionists in Siskiyou County, California, and elsewhere in this region down here, guided their publicity stunts from the filmed roadblock on the Pacific Highway to the orchestrated parade with a throng of sign-carrying Jeffersonians through downtown Wairika. A parade in which, by the way, marchers placard speech to the face of our country's third president, not that, as some have suggested, of Jefferson Davis. Suggestions that because we're so rancorous and so benighted and retrograde down here, that it was Jeff Davis, the place was, this so-called state was named after without any merit. Now, both these events, the parade, roadblock, and so forth, were staged largely for the benefit of newsreel cameras. Weekly newsreels in the theaters around the country were showing this episode. Gilbert Gable and Randy Collier proposed to county commissioners of all adjacent counties of California and Oregon, including Jackson and Josephine counties, meaning Medford and Grants Pass over in Josephine County, that they join to establish a new state of Jefferson. Among other suggested names were the state of Middle West Costia, terrible idea. The state taking parts of the county names and putting it together was the state of Del Curisque. And my personal favorite, because I think it was the most accurate, the state of Discontent. The secession movement took shape during 1941, November of 1941. And the new state symbol was a gold pan with two X's, the double cross, to evoke residents' resentment towards faithless Sacramentoan signal. Among the several proposed tongue-in-cheek state mottos was, "Our roads are not passable, they're hardly jackassable." Proponents affirmed that the new state would, quote, secede every other Thursday, end quote, until further notice. A governor was elected, if you will, Crescent City, California Judge John Childs, who was standing next to Randy Collier in that photo I showed previously. And Wairika was declared the new state's capital. Well, the soon to become famous December 1941 roadblock on the Pacific Highway just outside of Wairika, with those armed Stetson-wearing Jeffersonians passing out the new state's declaration of secession to passing motorists, gained lots of national coverage. It was all good fun. The main energy for the movement came from business people and politicians in Curry County, Oregon, and in Siskiyou and Del Norte counties in California, but with pleas for their immediately adjacent neighboring counties to join the effort. However, not just any county was considered suitable for admission to this new state, 49th state. Some were thought to be located too far afield and thus might dilute the impact of the publicity. When representatives of California's Lassen County first asked to join, one Siskiyou County official, in a bit of Jeffersonian vulgarity, publicly sent a bottle of cod liver oil to Lassen County commissioners with the advice to go start your own movement. As far as we know, far more significant, as we know, far more significant events intervened the day before the Jeffersonians' scheduled publicity extravaganza to be held on December 8, 1941. And so the war came, and we won, and then came that great post-war economic boom, including the baby boom and the housing boom that created a vibrant timber-based economy in this region down here and gave respite between the second and third phases of our search for identity. Alas, in 1956, and still feeling left out of the post-war boom, Curry County residents, particularly loggers in the town of Brookings and mill workers there, did protest the poor condition of the Coast Highway, Highway 101. They demanded faster and safer transport of logs to their mill and of Brookings-made lumber to railheads situated well to the north and the south. simply another attention-getting campaign, obviously modeled on the 1941 campaign. Their proposed 49th state of Shasta was not to be. They were actually joining in again with Californians who were promoting a secession from the rest of California over the big controversy of using Northern California water to irrigate much of the Central Valley of California. But ironically, although their gimmick was swept away by world events, the 1941 Jeffersonians' ultimate hopes of massive natural resource development indeed did come to pass. The 4 prosperous decades between the early 1950s and the late 1980s brought thousands of miles of new logging roads into roadless country. Roads used by loaded log trucks coming one after another down from the forest to the proliferating new sawmills and plywood mills that, working double and even triple shifts, now produced for an insatiable national market. So in the long run, the market needs of the post-war boom succeeded beyond those 1941 Jeffersonians' wildest pre-war dreams. Federal and state infrastructure dollars came pouring down into this region. Now, ironically, perhaps, it was, in my opinion at least, largely as a consequence of those great post-war boom years that the third phase of our search for identity began. And that search is ongoing still. It's what I'd call a contested search for a true regional identity. Think of it. A search for one's identity can be taken as a sign of one's sense of uncertainty, of insecurity, even anxiety. Often it's a search undertaken by adolescents and young adults. I think, at least metaphorically, that's been the case with this current third phase of our area's search. When, as a young man in the late 1960s, I first came to the Rogue River Valley from the East Coast, I'd never heard of the 1941 State of Jefferson movement. And indeed, many people living here were not really familiar with it until a bit later. Unlike today, at the time I arrived here, that story was not nearly as widely known and prominent in local popular consciousness as it would later become. Continuing on through the end of America's phenomenal post-war economic boom, I put it in the early 1980s, our region enjoyed a rocking, accelerating ride of logging huge quantities of federal timber. The mills remained incredibly busy, and the Southern Pacific's railroads trains pulled out of Medford every few days, filled with lumber, plywood, and bins of pear. Set their watches here to the lunchtime whistle of the now. Here in what we might call northern Jefferson, meaning north of the state boundary, National Forests and Bureau of Land Management's Oregon and California grant lands, the timber harvest dollars from logging those lands, federal lands, poured into county coffers, building new schools, justice centers, jails, parks, and roads. As well, by the mid to late 1970s began yet another very large and continuing influx of newcomers arriving from elsewhere, the Bay Area, Southern California, Portland, Puget Sound, and people like me from back east. Simultaneously came a greatly expanding arrival of people that slowly expanded, but greatly expanded from Mexico and elsewhere. Well, alas, economic success can often bring its own set of new problems, perceived or real problems, and it brings its own new worries. For some residents of our region down here, especially newcomers, it was worry about the rate and amount of our area's commodification of natural resources from the mountains, logging of old growth trees, for example, as well as worry about the pace of development down here in the valleys. And I think it's this anxiety that contributed greatly to the development of an emerging regional consciousness, a sense of our area's specialness. This post-1970s search for a usable regional identity fairly naturally, if opportunistically, took over that old State of Jefferson name. And did that as a means of increasing the growing consciousness of this area as a unique bioregion. Environmental activists and others utilize the phrase State of Jefferson as a way to highlight the region's undeniable biological diversity, which it really, really does, and it definitely makes this area special, and its aesthetic values. However, for others, some of them, also relative newcomers, by no means all, but those newcomers who might have come here mainly for the low tax rates and or simply to be left the hell alone, the State of Jefferson identity became their own badge as a supposedly self-reliant rebels, fixated on their own personal property rights in their own little patch of heaven. And it's this mindset that in 2013 prompted the recent unsuccessful effort by some Southern Jeffersonians to kind of tea party their way to secession. This time it was a serious, if, as I firmly believe, utterly self-deluded attempt at separation. This sentiment has often been mixed with wildly blown fears of what some people perceive as encroaching state and federal takeover. And ironically, here in Southwestern Oregon especially, the lure of low property taxes, some of these people remain reluctant to admit, had been largely courtesy of the federal government's incredibly generous federal timber sale receipts sharing formula for these counties, the Oregon and California land grant counties. It was a formula, one developed by big government during the New Deal, that was far more generous than the standard federal timber receipt arrangements found in any other part of the West. On the other hand, I think that for many, even most residents, this third phase's State of Jefferson regional identity consciousness is far more subtle than either the bioregional or the local sovereignty approaches just mentioned. And here are some of the local sovereignty folks shown here. It appeals to us because, especially since the late 1970s, our region has become less and less distinctive, less rural, more and more like every place else. We've become more urban, more cosmopolitan, more dominated by the very same big box stores that popped up like mushrooms in the places some of us originally fled from. And so I think it's that search for identity, a search born in part of newer residents' anxiety over what they are losing in terms of regional distinctiveness that has helped fuel this current phase. And also I think there's an element that I would have to say is like some of us newcomers possibly desire to quickly put on the mantle, to don the cloak, so to speak, of being a real live local as soon as possible. That is, it's an effort to claim personal ownership to the region, to put down a kind of self-comforting psychological roots in one's new home. One can conveniently put down such roots by reveling in a bit of distinctive, if not always fully understood or fully accurate regional history. We must recall that we're not at all unique down here in this would-be secessionist history of ours. It's been a part of American history that stretches from the 1790s State of Franklin proposal, which would have combined Western North Carolina with Eastern Tennessee, on through the 1920s secession threat of Northern Illinois, basically Chicago, which basically the polar opposite of the State of Jefferson, erupted from long-standing urban resentment at rural control of Illinois state government. And it has continued into quite recent times, from sawing California into 2 or more pieces, to separation of New York City and Long Island from upstate New York. So our perhaps not so United States have seen at least 24 secession, quote unquote, or separation schemes of varying degrees of seriousness in the past 2 decades. So let me close with just a little bit of irony. Jackson County and Josephine County are the 2 places in the region down here, the so-called state of Jefferson, that today make the most commercial and popular hoopla. By far the biggest ballyhoo out of the state of Jefferson history and identity, that secession story of 1941. It's commemorated by a plethora of recent and current institutional names, from Jefferson State Bank, Jefferson State Plumbing, and Jefferson State Freight Company, to Jefferson Public Radio, the State of Jefferson Rock Band, State of Jefferson Choir, Medford's Jefferson Nature Center, and Josephine County's Jefferson State Music Festival and Hemp Exposition. However, back in 1941, guess which 2 counties faint-hearted Board of Commissioners? Counties located well within the originally proposed boundaries of the 1941 state of Jefferson got cold feet and refused to officially endorse the idea. Which 2 counties declined to sign on to the secession movement officially? Jackson and Josephine counties. So with that, I thank you very much. And as promised, there's a story of those 2 eyeballs on the plaza in Ashland. It's an alder tree. Okay, well, I guess I need to stop sharing.
Oh, Jeff, that was wonderful. Just wonderful. Dave, why don't you start with your first question here?
Okay. Yes, you mentioned bioregional efforts. I didn't hear you mention specifically Cascadia, which is the one I've heard the most about. And that's an effort, I think, that stretches all the way from parts of California up into British Columbia. Have you, entertained how your efforts would fit into that effort, or has it just been not worth the effort because that's never achieved a level of seriousness?
Yeah, that came out of largely, I think, of Ernst Kallenbach's book Ecotopia back in the 1970s, with permutations thereafter. And I would have to say that there is some resonance, but I don't think it ever came to an actual proposed secession. And so that's what I'm trying to deal with here, where people got either upset enough or got excited enough to do a publicity gimmick to invest all that time and treasure into doing such a thing. That's what I suggest anyway. So, and certainly, if it were to come to pass, hypothetically, this kind of environmentalist Cascadia or Ecotopia, I can tell you that people down here would secede from it.
Well, that's sort of what I was wondering.
We'd have a secession from a secession. Yes.
It sounded like Cascadia was all united behind this Ecotopia type thing, and your description of Jackson sounded separate from that. So it sounded like it would actually interfere with any of these Cascadia efforts.
It definitely would.
It would break it in half.
We're contrarians down here, and always have been since the beginning. Southern Oregon was the only part of the state to give a plurality in the 1860 election to John Breckinridge, the pro-slavery Democrat candidate, running against Lincoln, whereas Lincoln won, not overwhelmingly in Oregon. But so we're a lot different down here, and there's a lot of rancor down here. I live at Ashland. Ashland talent is a little blue bubble in a sea of red.
Yeah.
Okay, and our board of commissioners, basically, you know, we're in our little bubble, blue bubble, we're taxed without representation because it's all Republican county commissioners, very, very conservative ones. So, you know, maybe we should secede from Jackson County. But anyway, so I hope there's another question.
There is, yes. So we have a question from Al. Al, go ahead.
Okay. You're about on a par. I think your efforts at statehood have been about on a par with Mussylvania. If you can remember 1962, Jay Ward, the creator of the Rocky and Bullwinkle show, drove all over the country, gathered 50,000 signatures in favor of statehood for Mussylvania, and drove his Volkswagen bus then up to the White House to deliver the signatures. And unfortunately, he got there the day that the Cuban Missile Crisis went public, so they didn't have time to give him any time of day. But you're a guy who puts things into perspective. And we've got this problem coming up in the United States that the 12 most populous states will have 2/3 of the population within another census or two, but only 25% of, less than 25% of the votes in the United States Senate. We've got one man, one vote's been the law of the land for over 50 years, except at the federal level. So we've got problems looming. Have you given any thought to those about how we're going to have a proper balance between rural and urban in this country?
Well, you know, it's going to be a battle royal trying to do anything about it. I mean, the great rotten borough, as they called them in Great Britain during the 19th century, of
we've got them.
Depopulated areas being represented in Parliament. Our example of the great rotten borough is Wyoming. Hardly anybody there with 2 senators weighing in. So, but as far as secession goes, trying to get it back to that theme, you know, there's only been 2 cases in the United States history, and I'm probably aware of them. In 1820, Maine became a separate state as part of the Missouri Compromise. And it was part of Massachusetts, but Massachusetts said, okay, we don't really need those people up there. And they accepted that, and it was passed. And then the other, of course, during the Civil War, when West Virginia joined the Union, all those mountaineers loyal to the Union, not much in the way of slaveholding in that part of Virginia. So those are the only 2 successful cases in it, and there are many, many large barriers, like for actual splitting up of states to ever happen. But you raise a excellent question. It's one I can't answer. It bothers me a lot. It's unfortunately something the founding fathers, they should have put something in there, I think, where they could have said, well, if as the country grows and population grows, if a state falls below a certain threshold and the percentage of national population, well, maybe they only have 1 senator. So,
was your guy there in Southern Oregon you talked about at the beginning of the talk, was he Breckinridge's running mate in 1860? And was he the only Oregonian ever on a national ticket?
That was not Tavolt. That was Joseph Lane, after whom Lane County is named, and who was a territorial governor here for a while. He was also one of Oregon's first 2 U.S. senators after statehood in 1859, and he was the running mate, of John Breckinridge. And there was he may have done in part. I need to explain that perhaps Breckinridge did as well as he did down here in part because Lane was on the ticket. He was a favorite son. But still, it's a very different vote down here than it was in the rest of Oregon. But Lane was a pro-Southerner, born in the South, but spent most of his time in southern Indiana, the so-called butternut districts that were settled by Ohio River Valley people originating from the Upper South. Didn't want slavery, but they believed in the old, Jeffersonian, Jacksonian property rights and so forth. And he came out to let the slaveocracy have its rights to expand across the country, which is absolutely the opposite of what Lincoln was standing for. And the South demanded that they be able to continue to expand slavery across the continent. As most of you know, that was the whole issue in that election. And so then Lane comes back to Oregon after the election, and things are completely unsettled. States are seceding in the South, and he sails southward to the Isthmus of Panama, and then gets a steamship and comes up north to Portland just at the time of the firing on Fort Sumter, which the news reached, that at the time that news reached Oregon. And that precipitated a huge upswell in unionist sentiment, including among, states' rights Democrats. They just could not see abandoning the Union. And here the first shots were fired by those slavocrats down in John Calhoun's little slaveocracy down there in South Carolina. And so he was immediately hung in effigy and burned in effigy as he traveled by stage south to his home in Douglas County. So, but later, Oregon did have, down here, we had issues over, let's call it loyalty, not just to Vault, but other folks down here. Anyhow, that's probably enough of that. Any other questions?
Yeah, we've got tons. Yes, we've got many.
Okay.
Next question, David Beam has a question.
Yeah, my question has to do with the taxation issue. I know with certainly the lower timber receipts and all that sort of stuff, then suddenly the counties weren't getting all this money and affecting things like closing libraries and reductions in police force. I mean, it sounded like it was going to get pretty much back to the old Wild West and everything. I'm just curious what you have comments, what your experience. Do you think they're ever going to start seeing more that we need some more of these social systems like the police and libraries and whatever? Just kind of what your experience and comments might be about that.
Well, I would have thought this before the fires, but which I hope down here are not a long-term setback economically and population-wise. I mean, I'm not for more people moving here myself, having, watched this valley transform from very, very rural to very, very urban sprawl kind of place. But I think as more people move here from other areas, they're going to demand and outweigh the wishes of those who just feel they can, roll up the welcome mat, hunker down their own little, fortress, as many people do out in the boonies in this area.
Right.
It's really something out there. Some very, very fine people with Trump signs in their front yards, give you the shirt off their back, but they're never gonna go for higher taxes, and they don't give a rip about libraries. That's for those other people, and so on and so forth. Just leave us alone. And but I think that will probably become submerged. And just the point here that's probably pretty obvious, almost from well before the 1941 secession campaign, people were talking about, our tax dollars, we don't get enough from Sacramento and Salem, we're not getting our fair share, and so on and so forth. Well, that is absolutely untrue. This region was being subsidized by tax dollars from people like you up north and down south. We got far more in state expenditures than went out from this region in terms of taxes paid. And that's just one of the ironies and hypocrisies and ignorant opinions of the people behind this recent state of Jefferson secession movement. If
Yeah,
we
I
were
think
to
that's it.
secede, we would rank well below Mississippi in terms of all the things that are important.
Yeah. That same argument's made between the red states and the blue states. It's
Oh yeah, yeah.
same bogus
yeah.
argument that's made between red and blue states. Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've
Okay.
got a couple comments from Paul Pappas. The state of Franklin actually has a constitution and did submit an application to the Continental Congress.
Huh.
And a comment from Sue Pierce. I recall plans for Cascadia over beers at Goose Hollow Inn during the early Watergate years for the reasons just mentioned. The inclusion of Humboldt County was important for its primary crop. From Nancy Pappas. Since a civil war was fought over the rights of states to secede the Union, I wonder why anyone entertains the thought, since it appears to be a fool's errand. Do you have a comment about that?
There are, who am I to deny the fact that there are millions of people in this country that believe absurd things firmly, utterly firmly, and they're deep in their heart. And some of these, the 2013 Jeffersonian proponents are, they believe they can do it. And what's more, that whole state of Jefferson movement of theirs spread beyond the original quote boundary of the state of Jefferson, became spread throughout much of California. And I've seen signs during trips, Arizona, join the state of Jefferson, up in Washington State, join the state of Jefferson. And so it's just part of this whole rancorous rural versus urban divide. It's become just another shorthand version.
Sue Pierce has a comment and a question. In all of the large Western states, there are parts of the state far removed from the capital. Sacramento is even further away from the population centers of Southern California than it is from the northern counties. How do the plans for Jefferson mesh or not with the current movement for a large segment Eastern and Southern Oregon, a large segment of Eastern and Southern Oregon to leave Oregon and become a part, another part? Yeah.
Yeah. They don't really mesh. I would say they overlap in intent, in philosophy, and in basis in resentment. But I don't see anything really happening to cause them to become one and the same or anything like that. So
Joyce Lackey has a question. Joyce, you want to unmute and come in, please?
Okay. I lived in Colorado. The latter part of my time there was the sort of very quiet secessionist movement from the northeastern part of the state, which is very rural. And of course, the main impetus to me seemed to be economic. Do you know of any secessionist movement ever that was not based in some way on economics, including the slavery issue?
Well, meaning slavery is an economic issue.
Yes.
Yeah. Some, I think it's at root economic. Some simply feel, like the people in northernmost Idaho, they all go to Spokane, that's their capital. And we have nothing in common with way down there in Boise. And so some of it is based on maybe convenience in the economics of long distance travel versus, the convenience of having a fairly large city quite close, but in a different state. And there's a lot of places like that in the various states. Not all have toyed with some sort of secession, but that factor of distance and inconvenience has been a factor, maybe not so much for secession, but it's certainly been a factor in feelings of grievance elsewhere.
Mhm. Thank you.
Paul Pappas had a comment. Climate migration just is the next big issue for sociologists and politicians. Climate migration, people moving due to climate issues. I always thought that folks would be coming, for me, I always thought people would be coming our way and we would be a climate mecca. But after the fires this week, I have my doubts. Any thoughts about climate migration and what's happening will be happening to the counties that would be considered themselves Jefferson, the state of Jefferson?
Well, climatically, southwestern Oregon really is essentially part of California, you know, in terms of a climatic, vegetation, biotic region, much more than it is part of the stereotypical Pacific Northwest, much drier, hotter. So what would happen here, I don't know. It's, you know, there's certainly going to be impacts here that are being looked at in terms of fire, in terms of water availability, in terms of being able to irrigate. We're probably going to eventually, the waters that currently come into the Rogue River Valley that have been legally kind of pirated from adjacent watersheds, such as the Upper Klamath Basin, there will be suits and blah, 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 and it'll go on, and probably, I would imagine, eventually that water will be turned off and go back into the Klamath River. Climate is definitely going to have an impact on all of us. We can't really say exactly what and how bad it will be by when, but you know, I can certainly see more people coming here and up to Portland and so forth. But you know, you're going to be having issues up there as well. There's really nowhere to go.
There's nowhere to go.
One planet. So I don't know if that answers the question.
It does. Thank you. I've got a question that I'm going to take a turn here. I was interested in the roadblocks, that roadblock that they set up, and it sounded like it was going to be a day, and it was going to be December 8th, if I understood you correct, of 1941,
yes.
Which was not a very well chosen. I mean, certainly they would not have made much news that day. But was that just a stunt, really just a stunt, or was it an ongoing roadblock?
It was a stunt that may have gone on for, you know, some days.
Okay.
They were simply handing out flyers. You know, they were carrying shotguns and Winchesters and
they were
and so forth, and wearing the cowboy hats and wearing boots. But it was a stunt, and Stanton Delaplane and Randy Collier made certain that, you know, the newsreel cameras were there. There's newsreel film footage of the parade in downtown Wairika. There's newsreel footage of the so-called initial declaration, where that still of Randolph Collier and Judge Childs are shown, and declaring Wairika the new state capital. They had their ducks lined up pretty well to get, and Stanton Delaplane was really at it, and he earned some fame from this. In fact, I think it was a terrible thing. The 1942 Pulitzer Prize went to the San Francisco Chronicle for its coverage of this event. All the things that they could have covered, but they wanted something kind of upbeat, you know. It was rather ridiculous to give the Pulitzer Prize.
Ridiculous.
But it was definitely a gimmick. There are old timers down there who I've met and talked to who were kids when this happened, young kids, and who are convinced in their own mind that, you know, this is all grassroots and a groundswell, and we did it all us here in Siskiyou County, and that is not so.
Yep.
So
So well
again, you know,
executed.
history can be very inaccurate.
Yeah.
But they were going to have the big publicity, groundswell, celebration, etc., declare actual secession, so on December 8th.
Okay.
On December 8th, they said, we are, as patriotic Americans, we now end our secession attempt, and we're going to help win the war. So that's how
right.
that ended.
And we've got time for one more question. I think Dave DiNucci, are you ready?
I will actually, I think he just answered my question. It was about, you know, the dynamics of ending phase one when the Civil War came along. I was wondering if this movement was seen as, you know, unwelcome now that we were all unified together against slavery, and it sounds like you've answered that they kind of decided that they were going to join in. So maybe you can move on to Mike's question.
Yeah, we do have time for one more. Then, how much? This is a question from Mike Burchett. How much influence do the alt-right white nationalists, Christian nationalists, have in today's secessionist movement in that region, in the region of Jefferson?
I cannot tell you. I don't really know. I know some of the people that were heavily involved. I don't know them well, but I worked with them on some projects down in Siskiyou County, Forest Service type projects. Nice people, but go into their living room and there's all these books by Glenn Beck and so forth, and sweet people. But I can only tell you that the people I've met, I don't think they're white nationalists in that kind of semi-Nazi sense of the word, but I think, like so many people in the GOP base, they feel that they're the real Americans. Yeah. The people in the cities really aren't, especially with all those newcomers. They're not really like us. We've been here forever and we've been hardworking and so on and so forth. We're the salt of the earth, and therefore our vote should count a hell of a lot more than those people in the cities, because that's basically what they're saying. So.
Yeah, the double cross symbol caught my eye there, about, you know, from those earlier photos, and I think I've seen that a similar design on a lot of Trump supporters and alt-right people. So that kind of put that in my mind.
Yeah, I think that it's more a secession, state of Jefferson. I don't know that white supremacists have actually taken it over, made it their own. I think they tend to have a lot of their own kind of symbols that are, you know, read and understood by the cognoscenti. So, but I'm sure there are some.
Sure.
I have no doubt, but I just can't tell you how strong it is. I can tell you that the strength in the movement is strongly people that I profoundly disagree with. That's all I can tell you.
Okay, Jeff, thank you for
okay.
Wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
The photos that you included in your slideshow were fascinating. Thank you for seeing that a look. You know, really getting a look back all those years ago. You did nice. Don't leave yet though. Hang on 2 seconds. Our president would like to thank you personally. So hang on. He's going to do that right now.
Hi, Jeff. We appreciate you being here today. And my name is Wayne. And we would like to offer you a HGP mug, and we'd like to send that to you. And appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
you very much.
Right.